All right, let's get started. Good morning. My name is Erica Perrell. I'm the communications manager at APEC, and I'm really happy that you can all join us this morning. I'm just going to do a couple of quick notes before I hand the virtual microphone over to my colleague, David Chandy. And as I mentioned earlier, for those of you on the phone, the presentations for this session are available online now so that you can follow along. They're on the APEC website under the webinar, as well as under the agenda for the session. And as I mentioned, as long as technology cooperates, we'll have the webinar on our website as well, available tomorrow to stream tomorrow morning. We'll also email out a link to that directly. Please feel free to share with your friends and colleagues or anyone who might find it helpful. While you're on the website, you'll also notice that we do have additional research that APEC's been doing on the economic impacts of COVID-19 in Atlantic Canada, as well as other research, including clean growth in Atlantic Canada. I think David will mention that a little bit later on. To make sure that you're up to date on our research and events, please follow us on social media, Twitter and LinkedIn. That's sort of the first place that will notify you of new research that we're releasing, as well as event information. You can also subscribe for email updates. So we do promise not to inundate your inbox. And then finally, APEC is a membership-based organization. And again, David will mention this a little later, but if you're interested in supporting the research that we do, membership information is available on the members section of our website. You can also feel free to reach out to any of my colleagues. Our contact information is also available on our website. Again, sort of one more time for those just joining us, the presentations for today's session are already available on the website, and a copy of the webinar, a recording of the webinar will be available by tomorrow morning. With that, I'd like to hand that virtual microphone over to APEC's President and CEO, David Chandy, who will host and moderate today's session.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We very much appreciate you signing in. This is the first in a three-part series, so we're glad that you're able to join us for the first session. And again, thank you to Colleen Dontremont and the Atlantica Centre of Energy for partnering with us on this session. As Erica mentioned, we are a membership organization. We've been providing a lot of analysis on the unfolding and potential economic impacts of COVID-19 since March, and we're continuing to track that in our analysis. We provided a lot of that information available freely for members and non-members, and we've had 5 very successful webinars earlier in the year. We are transitioning back to our more regular member publications. We released our major projects inventory earlier in July for our members. Last week, we released our provincial economic updates for each of the 4 Atlantic provinces to track how the COVID recovery is going. And we'll soon be getting ready to release our annual economic outlook forecast later this fall. Again, those are some of the benefits you get for membership. So we certainly encourage you to take advantage of those. And our next webinar series after this one is our annual outlook series. This will be by webinar. They will be paid sessions, and again, members will benefit from discounted rates. So if you're not a member, we certainly encourage you to become a member and benefit from those lower rates for those sessions. So I'd like to just begin by talking about some of the things we've been discussing in our COVID webinars. And as we've talked about COVID and the recession, we've really talked about 4 kind of key long-term issues and drivers and forces that are impacting this region, shaping our future, and how we move out of COVID into the recovery and what the future holds. And those long-term forces are our demographics, changing global markets, automation and digitalization, and sustainability. And each of those has had an additional push or impetus from COVID-19. And changing weather and climate patterns are certainly having economic effects. We have seen this in storms, with Newfoundland having a big snowstorm earlier this year, Dorian last year, frosts, flooding, warmer oceans impacting icebergs for our offshore industry, our fishery. And this is a topic that we had planned to do some work on this year. COVID has kind of pushed that back, but it's certainly looking at the economic and business implications of changing weather and climate patterns are important for this region to understand. But energy has also been an important driver of our economy. We've seen that in Newfoundland's offshore energy industry. We've seen that in Nova Scotia in its offshore. I posted a picture on social media of the Deep Canoe platform. Production has ended a couple of years ago, and kind of those facilities are now awaiting their own recycling. We've seen this with big investment projects. So energies have been a key driver, but it's also a key part of the story when we look at environment and greenhouse gas emissions, especially in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick with historical reliance on fossil fuels. So this is a topic we have looked at in the past. We released a report on clean growth in Atlantic Canada. A couple of years ago, there was a supplementary study on growing our clean technology firms. One of the speakers will be talking about some of those opportunities later. So this is a topic that's continuing to be important to us. Since we released that report, Canada and several of the Atlantic provinces have set formal or informal targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This is certainly an ambitious target that requires either a reduction in gross emissions to zero, which is likely not feasible without completely shutting down our economy, or it requires emissions reductions along with carbon capture, other offsets, or purchasing emissions reductions from elsewhere. So either way, this is an ambitious target that will have important implications for this region. It's important we start to understand what would that look like and what is Atlantic Canada's clean growth going to look like over the next few decades, and what is the role of energy within that. And that's really why we are having this series to look at Atlantic Canada's energy future. But if we just step back and look at a moment what we've seen in the past, we certainly had this period in the past of growing economy and growing greenhouse emissions. But since the mid-2000s, we've seen our emissions in Atlantic Canada taper off, while our economy, when we look at overall growth, has not really been very strong. And this is not really what we're looking for when we look for clean growth. When we look for clean growth, we want the economy continuing to track up as we see nationally, and we want to see improved environmental performance. And that's really kind of decoupling kind of economic growth from the environmental reductions. But also when we look at what's driven those reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Atlantic Canada, certainly policy played a role, increased renewable energy and renewable energy policies, but it's also because we saw a reduction in output in some of our key producers and emitters, like some of our forest and paper mills, and also in the mining sector. So this again is not really clean growth. So as we begin this series, what we're really looking for, how do we help support and nurture and grow the economy in a way that's sustainable and supports this transition to cleaner economic growth? So this is why we're holding this session. This is the first of 3 sessions. The next session will focus a bit more on some specific technologies that are emerging in the energy sector. And the third session, the final session, will talk more about what the utilities are doing, their role, and the potential for greater regional cooperation and collaboration. So that's where we're going. Again, I'd like to thank Colleen with the Atlantica Centre of Energy for partnering with us, and I'll now hand over for her to make some remarks and introduce our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, David. Appreciate that. Good morning. As David says, I am Colleen D'Entremont, President of the Atlantica Centre for Energy, and we're a think tank that examines energy issues in the Atlantic region. And the idea is to get information out to the public on energy issues that is confronting Atlantic Canada. Our region does need to create sustainable, ongoing economic activity, and the energy sector can be a big part of that. Our role at the Centre is to examine the energy issues in Atlantic Canada and help people understand the complexity and the implications of various courses of action. In order to do this, we really do have to broaden the discussion around energy and help people gain a greater understanding of the energy issues. So often people want change, but they don't have all the facts to completely understand the issue. What brings us all here today is to listen and ask questions of leaders in their field. So the Atlantica Centre for Energy is a member of APEC, and we do appreciate all of the information that they do make available to members. So we approached them about developing this series on information, energy webinars to create discussion on the energy issues that we're facing. So welcome to all of you that are here today. This is, as David mentioned, the first of 3 sessions, and we have 4 excellent panelists to bring us their perspectives from literally across the country. All of their bios, by the way, are available on the APEC website, so you can get detailed information about each of them there. First up is Herb Emery. He's the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick. And Herb will examine how Atlantic Canada should focus its efforts on a sustainable and prosperous energy future. Speaking second will be Rachel Sampson, and she's of the Clean Growth Research Director at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Rachel will provide details of new research that is just being released by the CICC, and this is on the impacts of clean growth. And David did point out the difference there about growth in the clean energy sector. Next will be Charlene Johnson, CEO of NOYA, who joins us today from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Charlene will discuss the ongoing importance of the offshore sector and its path to a sustainable future. And finally, our rounding up the panel will be Larry Hughes, and he is a professor at Dalhousie University. Larry will focus on the importance of energy security in Atlantic Canada today and in the years ahead. So thank you all. Thanks very much to the panelists for joining us today. And I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Herb Emery and ask for his introductory remarks. Herb?
Thanks, Colleen. And thanks, everyone, for being here this morning and giving me the opportunity to present. There's two main branches to this theme of a prosperous future for the Atlantic economy. If we were doing this presentation a decade ago, we would mainly be talking about the role of energy exports as a driver of wealth creation and trying to figure out, say, mitigating strategies around that. But what we were looking for was more exports. What we're looking at today is we have a different situation in that there's less support across Canada for energy exports as a driver. And we have to then think about the way the discussion is pivoted, and I'm going to focus more on the regional economy in terms of what it means for our producers, who we have to remember traditionally are exporters, and we have to think about what role does cleaner energy play in their competitiveness and allowing them to grow their exports, capture market share, or even remain in the region. Because the path that David highlighted previously is really picking up. We've lost competitiveness in a lot of areas, particularly in energy for producers, and that's what's making us look cleaner. The other thing we've encountered over the summer when we were trying to talk about different paths for the New Brunswick economy headed into the fall and post-COVID is that there's a growing number of Canadians who don't believe that growth is necessary for our prosperity. So instead, what we see is that cleaner energy is part of a dematerializing of the economy, in a sense, moving us away from being producing and exporting and having more sustainable local development based on more consumers and local production. And so in that case, the problem isn't for cleaner energy, isn't about competitiveness, it's really about affordability. So if we want to make sure that we have our lights on when we need them and making sure it's affordable, we're starting to talk about energy systems that are around that and talking about technologies as opposed to the overall energy market or how things are going to work. And the challenge we face in this transition is, besides not knowing which future we're talking about to define prosperity, which is getting back to being producers, exporting into global markets because we're competitive, or moving more towards a post-industrial local economic development model, is that we have strong path dependence in our energy system and energy supply in Atlantic Canada. And historically, it's been based on a power for industry model, which was large mega projects invested typically at the level of province to attract industry to the province to produce. Pulp and paper was obviously a huge one for New Brunswick, but also the other provinces. And what that did is it created a mindset and a legal corporate structure which is based on the province as the supplier of energy, in a sense, as opposed to provinces working within a regional system of energy supply. It's left us in New Brunswick, because we glutted cheap electricity, we had to make sure we had consumers using it. We now have inefficient use of electricity, which is creating cost problems in the region. The level of baseboard heating, the lack of natural gas as a supply, we haven't diversified. We're now facing big capital costs and capital renewals. We're having difficulty replacing that with the existing fiscal environment. And what we see is that we've got increasing costs of power or energy in the region, which is leading to a loss of competitiveness. And we're seeing exits of companies to other regions that don't have the same issues. We've also had a cultural shift in the mid-2000s towards fairness in energy pricing, which removed some of the historical focus on maintaining low power rates for heavy industry as your anchor user to keep overall costs low. And as a consequence, we now have a diminishing excess supply to we have enough to supply the market, but we're now having to deal with things like peaker plants, which is driving a lot of the costs. And so, again, what we keep coming back to is we're doubling down on the existing system. We're failing to get the diversification into other energy sources. And now, rather than diversifying, we're talking about transitioning our reliance on electricity. And again, what's missing in the debate in the path forward is, are we doing this for competitiveness of our producers or to keep energy affordable for the consumers that will be here? And that's a big ambiguity with it. So what we're looking at is a bit of a spiral that as we go into this transition, we've already encountered that high energy costs have been contributing to the deindustrialization, which explains much of our admirable environmental record. If we don't do this transition correctly, we might further spur that. And so our main role will be, we're the offset for the rest of Canada headed towards net zero. We can just basically offload our industry, move towards the local development, and we could take transfers as a form of offset rather than trying to spur an industry that was coming in like maritime iron. So if we want to have a sustainable and energy future, I think what that requires first is we have to identify what future are we trying to achieve. Is it getting back to competitive exporters, or is it getting back to having affordable energy for a largely consumption-based economy? Do we need to be thinking about the level of province when we talk about this, or are we talking about a regional energy supply, which includes Quebec and which includes the investments coming out of Newfoundland and Labrador with the Muskrat Falls project? And then with the technological question, if we're going to go into renewables, are we potentially shutting out other technologies that might be coming in that might have allowed us to decarbonize and that might have allowed us to make things affordable? And so to me, those are some of the big questions that we haven't really encountered. And finally, what's missing in a lot of this discussion is that we haven't talked enough about how we use energy. And if we really get serious about decarbonizing in the energy transition, when do we start thinking seriously about our urban systems and other characteristics that affect energy consumption? For example, we could deregulate the requirement for energy service to rural, make it more of its own cost recovery, and force the transition to the urban centers, force the transition to mass transit and things along those lines. So as we're talking about renewable energy and cleaning things up, are we talking about sustaining how we use energy, or are we thinking of it in terms of a general shift in how Canadians relate to energy, how we make our living, and how we make sure that we're doing okay so that it is sustainable and prosperous going forward? So I don't have any concrete solutions for anything, but those are the questions that have been keeping me up at night lately. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Herb. Some very pointed questions there, I think helping to maybe frame some of the choices and the issues before us. So thank you for that. And now we'll hand over to Rachel to share her remarks.
Hi. Thanks very much. So today I'm going to give you a very quick sneak peek of some research that we have coming out tomorrow that's looking at measuring progress on clean growth across Canada. Next slide, please. So for our report, we define clean growth a bit differently than what you may have seen in the past. So while clean growth mostly focuses on the relationship between economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions, we broaden it to also consider improved Canadian well-being and also the impacts of a changing climate. So where we see clean growth is at the intersection points of these three broad objectives. And what we do is we develop a proposed indicator set to measure progress towards clean growth. So our 11 proposed indicators cut across three broad categories. The first is a set of goals that looks at the relationship between economic growth and climate change objectives, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving resilience to a changing climate. The next set of indicators is what we call catalysts. So those are the things we know we need to do in order to achieve those goals. Things like technology development, technology adoption, low carbon and resilient trade and competitiveness, and low carbon and resilient infrastructure investment. Our third category connects well-being with climate change. These are things that we know can slow or potentially accelerate progress towards our goals. Things like low carbon jobs, affordable energy, inclusive resilience, clean air, and thriving ecosystems. Next slide, please. So I can't go through all 11 indicators, but I'll give a bit of highlight of a few of them. So our first indicator looks at low carbon growth. And as David showed, this is about the decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions from GDP over time. And we do see that New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI are leaders in terms of decoupling. But as David mentioned, the levels of economic growth are lower than some other provinces. Newfoundland and Labrador, GHGs track GDP fairly closely over the period. And there are several drivers associated with the decoupling across the provinces. Electricity emissions intensity is a key factor, oil and gas extractive activities, energy efficiency changes, and economic structure in terms of shifting towards a greater service-based economy. In hydroelectric, actually just back to this previous slide, in hydroelectric provinces, we see one of the key aspects that's slowing decoupling is the transportation sector. Transportation emissions in many of the hydroelectric provinces are becoming the dominant source of emissions. Next slide, please. So in terms of our catalyst indicators, I'll give a bit of a sense of how Atlantic Canada does on those. So for technology development, we look at Statistics Canada's Environmental and Clean Technology Products Database and the change in real GDP over the period. There has been an increase in economic activity, but it has been driven largely by the Muskrat Falls project and Maritime Link and construction activities related to those projects. In terms of exports, we see fairly steady exports, mainly from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick over the period, with a slight spike in 2013 in Nova Scotia. And if anyone knows what caused that, I'd be happy to hear it. Next slide, please. The other indicator that we consider that is relevant to discussion is energy affordability. So we look at total energy costs as a share of total household energy expenditures and compare across regions. And what we see is that Atlantic households tend to pay proportionally more for energy than other regions. And that's particularly true for the lowest income quintiles in Atlantic Canada. Next slide, please. So overall, our indicators point to several areas for action. One is having a greater focus on how to achieve climate, economic, and well-being objectives simultaneously. So breaking down some of the policy silos and starting to think about these things in a more interconnected way. The second is to invest in better clean growth data to support policy development and design. We struggle to find data, and particularly in Atlantic Canada, it is hard to find disaggregated data that measures clean growth. The third is to tailor regional approaches depending on the specific factors that are slowing clean growth progress. The fourth is to have a clean growth lens for investment that not only looks at short-term jobs potential or greenhouse gas emissions, but considers the long-term benefits in terms of low carbon growth and resilient growth. The fifth is to better connect technology development with technology adoption. We know that a lot of the economic opportunities occur from technology development, but that a key barrier to technology development is weak adoption. And the key driver of technology adoption is government policy, such as carbon pricing, regulations, and procurement. The sixth is to connect economic development and skills policies to climate-related employment risks and opportunities. And this is going to become more important as jurisdictions ramp towards net zero targets and the global transition accelerates. The seventh is to target urban transportation, given the multiple opportunities in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving air pollution, and technology development. The eighth is to slow the loss of climate-related ecosystem services, such as forests and wetlands. While there's a lot of emphasis on investing in nature-based solutions, we also need to look at slowing the loss of ecosystem services from various human activities. And the ninth is to look at Indigenous-led initiatives. And this is an area where we see the opportunity to achieve economic, social, and climate objectives simultaneously. So I'll leave it there. The report is over 100 pages. It'll be on our website tomorrow for those who are interested in diving a little deeper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, for that. And again, I think as Herb and Rachel have kind of set this up, there's a lot of questions to be answered. There's more research and understanding how do we effectively kind of make this transition. So now I'd like to hand over to Charlene to talk about the Newfoundland offshore.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for having me today. I thought I'd start by painting a picture of what's happening in Newfoundland and Labrador. But while it's happening here, it certainly has an economic impact all across Canada. In fact, 12% of our NOAA membership is from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia alone. So prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore oil and gas industry had an extremely positive outlook. We had significant momentum going. Today, that story is very different. And in the next slide here, you'll see some very real examples of the impacts on our industry. We have drilling stopped at Hibernia. We have tieback postponed there. Hibernia-related exploration has been cut short. The West White Rose project, which has been in the news a lot lately, has put its first oil off for a year, and really the future of that project, it's currently under review and the future is unknown. We've had exploration drilling campaigns delayed. The Terra Nova asset life extension is on hold. We have our drilling rigs leaving our waters, heading to Norway. The refinery here has been temporarily closed and the postponement of upgrades there. And the new Frontier project, Bay du Nord by Equinor, that decision has been put on hold. So we say it's been death by 1,000 cuts here, but when you look at a budget, it's truly going to be death by billions of dollars. Yes, here we go. Typically in this, when I give this presentation, I would speak to how studies have shown our province stood to receive over $100 billion in royalties and revenue in the coming 2 decades. In fact, we hired David Campbell, an economist from New Brunswick, to do an economic impact study for us. And that $100 billion, that doesn't include the tens of thousands of jobs, the significant bumps to retail and housing markets, and all of that spin-off and induced economy impact. But now the numbers are not looking so bright, and these numbers were produced right from the province, from the government, about 2 months ago now. And the picture is very stark. You'll see over the next 10 years, because of all of these delays and cancellations that I just previously mentioned, over the next 10 years, the province will lose $11 billion in provincial revenues. And of course, this impacts programs, infrastructure, education, health, and the list goes on. 59 billion loss in total provincial GDP and 90,000 person years of work. And let's remember, Newfoundland and Labrador is a population of 500,000 people. So significant impacts on our economy and on our people here. The next slide. You know, the dark cloud is occurring despite the fact that we have tremendous resource. I'm sorry, that's one slide before. There you go, David. This is all happening despite the fact that we have a tremendous resource here, and our country, Canada, is being recognized as a leader in ESG practices. And even BMO, as you can see from the slide here, the Canada is ranked #1 for environmental, social, and governance practices. There's also been studies recently by Yale and Columbia, again, ranking Canada #1 out of the top 10 exporting countries for oil. We lead the country in environment, safety, rule of law, and regulatory regime. So when we talk about the clean growth and clean transition, I think Newfoundland and Labrador offshore is a big part of that solution. On to the next slide. So we are very advantaged here in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have a light sweet crude. It's on average about 30% below global greenhouse gases compared to other jurisdictions. Our offshore contributed just 0.23% of Canada's carbon emissions, yet it impacts our GDP by about 30%. That being said, we do recognize that we live in a climate-conscious world, and we support efforts to improve technology and to reduce emissions, and many of our members are doing just that. We've recently partnered with NIA, which is the Newfoundland Labrador Environmental Association here, and we've just released contracts to research electrification offshore, so powering platforms with hydro from shore. Newfoundland's very blessed to have lots of hydro, and Rachel mentioned the Muskrat Falls project. And we also have a lot of offshore wind. We have a lot of wind here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So our province did commit to net zero by 2050, and collaboration with organizations like NIA and the Technology Association and others are going to be key going forward to meet that goal. As I said, we're fortunate to have an abundance of natural resources, oil and gas, cobalt, hydro, wind, and all of this working together allows us to be a leading energy provider. If you'll see here from this slide, this is a project in Norway, the Johan Sverdrup, and they used hydro from shore for electrification. They reduced greenhouse gases by 80 to 90%. Our information is indicating that we can already lower our low carbon footprint with 30% below greenhouse gases already by another 60 to 70% doing that. So, I believe as we go forward in the future and we look at technology and sustainability, I believe we can do even better than we're doing right now in the future. And if you consider the Bay du Nord project, which is currently undergoing environmental impact statement now, this project would produce approximately half of the greenhouse gases of the current lowest emitting production facility offshore here in Newfoundland, Labrador. They have very aggressive targets to keep the lowest amount of greenhouse gases per barrel possible. And you'll see in this next slide here, offshore wind is another option that we have here, as I mentioned. Again, this is in Norway. This is one of the offshore wind farms. So this is part of the study we are working on right now to look at future platforms and how we can further lower the already low carbon footprint. So, we can and we should be world leaders. We have an abundance of resource here, and it's all forms of energy working together so that we can have energy security in Canada as well. And I won't get into that because I believe another speaker is talking about energy security and energy supply in Canada, but we can certainly play a major role in that. Last year, Canada imported $19.8 billion worth of oil, and we have an abundance of resource, and Canada has the third largest reserve. So tremendous opportunity going forward, and I look forward to discussing this further with many of you and being a partner as we go forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charlene, very much for that. And again, just helping us understand the opportunities to grow the economy and provide improved global environmental solutions as we kind of move forward. So again, thank you for that. And you mentioned security. So with that, we'll hand over to Larry Hughes to talk about energy security in Atlantic Canada. Larry?
Thank you, David, and good morning. Last week, I was approached by several planners asking for help with the video they are producing on the green potential of sustainable energy in Nova Scotia. I responded by noting that this is a broad topic covering all aspects of the province's energy system, from its principal energy providers, notably Irving and Nova Scotia Power, to the energy services used by Nova Scotians, typically transportation, heating and cooling, and activities requiring electricity. I also pointed out that energy users expect their energy providers to maintain energy security by ensuring their energy is available and affordable when needed and acceptable to society. If an event occurs that affects the energy security of an energy supply, the system's state changes from normal to either tension, in which energy is still available but is, for example, less affordable, or disruption, in which the energy is unavailable, for example, during a blackout. A system is said to be resilient if it can return to its normal state quickly. However, if the system cannot return to normal in a timely manner, it must adapt to the event, creating a new normal. Broadly speaking, adaptation is achieved by one of three policies, or a combination. Reduction policies that reduce energy demand, for example, financial incentives to retrofit buildings, or policies to discourage energy use, including carbon pricing. Replacement policies that either change the energy supply, but not how it is used, such as replacing petroleum products with biofuels, or use the same energy supply, but change how it is used, for example, replacing baseboard heating with heat pumps, and finally, restructuring policies that change both the energy and how it is used, Examples include shuttering of coal plants in favor of natural gas and renewables, and a consumer purchasing an electric vehicle rather than a conventional petroleum vehicle. Energy providers and energy users in the Atlantic provinces are adapting to events that have created new normals for them. For example, 34% of the energy used for residential space heating comes from biomass, due in part to the cost of electricity and fuel oil and the lack of natural gas access in the region. Nationally, it is 16%. Fear of COVID-19 affecting its supplies of crude oil has prompted Irving Oil to ship Western Canadian crude from Burnaby and the US Gulf Coast. Electricity blackouts caused by extreme weather events such as Hurricane Dorian, ice storms, and record-breaking snowstorms such as the one that hit St. John's earlier in the year, have resulted in many homeowners and business people purchasing generators to meet part of their electricity demand. Construction delays at Muskrat Falls is forcing Nova Scotia Power to rely on natural gas, while cost overruns will increase the price of electricity in Newfoundland and Labrador. Adaptation is not restricted to natural events and pandemics. It can also be the result of government policies. For example, Canada's pledge to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 requires policies that reduce energy demand and restructure energy systems to rely on low and non-carbon energy sources. In the Atlantic provinces, these policies have been influenced by concerns over the structure of existing energy systems and energy affordability. For example, the per capita consumption of oil products is 24% higher in Atlantic Canada than the rest of Canada, largely the result of transportation in rural areas and using fuel oil for space heating. Carbon-intensive fuels are still part of the electricity mix in all provinces except PEI, which still relies on NB Power for some of its electricity. In 2018, the median after-tax incomes in all 4 provinces were below the national average, as has been pointed out before, except PEI had weakest GDPs in Canada relative to their 2005 values. Consequently, emissions reduction policies attempt to minimize the costs to the energy user, such as energy demand policies reducing energy in buildings. The region's disparate carbon pricing systems are another example, with only New Brunswick having anything remotely resembling the federal government's carbon pricing requirements. By 2018, emissions relative to 2005 had declined in all provinces except Newfoundland and Labrador, which increased by about 4%. PEI's emissions fell by almost 20%, in part due to the increased use of electricity for electricity. Emissions also declined in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia by 34% and 26% respectively, as emissions-intensive industries struggled in weak economies. Future emissions reductions will depend on aggressive targets, like Nova Scotia's 53% reduction by 2030, which will largely be the result of a restructuring of the electricity system. However, restructuring the region's transportation systems is contingent on the availability of low-cost, low-emission vehicles. The challenge facing all energy providers, energy users, politicians, and yes, the planners I mentioned at the start of my talk, is how we maintain and improve energy security in the Atlantic provinces as we continue adapting to the conditions required for a low-carbon new normal. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry, very much, and to all the panelists for your remarks. Again, this is the first of a series, and we will be having 2 more on this, but we want to kind of open this up now for questions. So again, I'd encourage you to use the chat feature to ask your questions to the panelists. You can submit your questions through the chat. You should be able to see that towards the bottom of your top of your screen. But just while we're going, I will start with a question maybe to all our panelists, just to talk about, you talked about some of the questions and the challenges. I'd like you to, if you're willing to talk about, what would be the key opportunity right now that you think the Atlantic Canadian region should pursue? Like, what's one of the outstanding opportunities you see in front of us that would help us move forward, to help grow our economy, to help move forward in terms of a more sustainable growth? Who would like to kind of jump in on that? Like, what's one of the key opportunities you see in your sector, your province, or from the things that you talked about? Charlene, did you want to kind of add something to that from your perspective, from the offshore?
Sure, David. I sort of referenced it in my presentation, but currently in Newfoundland and Labrador, we are just operating in one basin, the Jeanne d'Arc Basin. We have now identified 20 more basins through work done out of a company in Paris, France, called Bicep Lab. And we now know that we have 20 basins with the potential for some very massive finds. One in particular that a lot of people talk about is Cape Reels. It's expected to have 5 to 6 billion barrels of oil. Of course, that it doesn't get cleared up until the exploration drilling is done. But if that's the case, with 5 to 6 billion barrels of recoverable oil, which is one of the largest prospects in the entire world right now, that has the potential for 3, maybe 4 FPSOs. And with each FPSO comes about 4,400 jobs, life of field. So there's great potential there. It's not as far from shore as, say, Bay du Nord is. So great potential there for either offshore wind or using our hydro resource to power that and further lower the already low carbon footprint that we are producing here. So for me, it's about finding those opportunities, not just in platforms, but throughout the entire supply chain. We have companies that are changing out the batteries on supply vessels, for instance, drilling rigs that are going with hybrid engines as well, companies that are installing geothermal. So the opportunity, I think, is to have the discussion around it's not either or. That's some of the polarizing things that I experience. It's either you have to turn off the taps to oil and end the supply here in Canada. All that means is shifting the supply to another country to meet our demand needs here in Canada. So it's about having the conversation. It's not about either or. It's about all forms of energy working together, and we will be connected on the grid now into the rest of Canada. So there's tremendous potential here to be leaders in the world, to be the envy of the world. Norway is leading in certainly some of these areas with offshore wind and hydro from shore, but we can be very close as leaders as well. And again, that's using technology and our environmental associations. And I saw somebody ask a question about small and medium-sized businesses. That's where the ingenuity is going to come from. And we have a tremendous opportunity, and I think that's the conversation that we need to continue having. It's one of the challenges that I see, but it's also a great opportunity.
Great, thank you, Charlene. So maybe, Rachel, I'll turn to you. And again, you highlighted kind of 9 kind of areas for action. Is there one area that you specifically think is a great opportunity or a priority for this region? And then a question that's come up from one of the panel, from the audience here, is around the role of small businesses. We did some work on clean technology firms. We had at that time a fairly small handful of clean technology firms. So what's the role of clean technology firms in terms of developing and supplying some of these solutions that might support this transition?
So one of the things that we look at when we look at low carbon growth and how to drive it is we compare it to research that's been done on how to accelerate productivity growth, for example. And we look at the different changes that need to happen comprehensively across the system. So we need changes within firms. So improving emissions intensity, fuel switching. But we also need to have a greater shift between economic activities from the higher carbon economic activities towards lower carbon economic activities. And we also need the increased entry of new firms, some of these innovative SMEs that we're talking about. So there's no one thing that needs to be done. It's all of those things to improve the competitiveness of existing sources of growth, existing sources of exports, but also to accelerate some of that new and innovative development. And so in terms of the key thing I would highlight is that connection between the technology development and the technology adoption. By pulling both levers, Governments can really help to drive the innovation at the same time and entry of new firms, while also driving that adoption and that market demand that works together to have a more successful outcome.
Great, thank you. So maybe Larry, there's a couple of questions that have come up that I might direct to you, and one of them is around kind of the role of natural gas, and should we be looking at developing more natural gas or using more natural gas in our kind of generation as a way of reducing imported coal and kind of growing the economy? Like, what's your sense on the role of natural gas in terms of our energy future and transition, and how that ties into energy security? We know there's a potential LNG plant that Pirides been looking to develop that would import some natural gas into this region. We also have Canaport there. So what's your thoughts on the role of natural gas in our energy future?
With respect to the natural gas, if we're talking about Sable, of course, Sable is now been shuttered, so we will not be getting natural gas from Sable, which probably means, unless there's localized fracking, we will need to import natural gas either through Canaport or through the Maritimes and Northeast pipeline. Natural gas will be a necessary fuel in the future, and you're seeing this with Nova Scotia Power, in part to phase out their coal, and by phasing out coal with natural gas, their emissions will decline. In fact, we've seen that this summer, or the past 6 months, in the past 2 quarters, Nova Scotia Power has dramatically reduced its coal consumption and increased its natural gas consumption. And as a result, its emissions in the second quarter fell about 6%. So there is an argument for natural gas as a bridge fuel to handle energy demand. With respect to natural gas as a long-term solution, because Nova Scotia Power's assumption is by 2040 or 2045, it will be making up a fair portion of Nova Scotia Power's overall energy mix. The problem is it is still emissions intensive, and the province talks about being net zero by 2050. If we're relying on natural gas, we should be doing everything we can not to rely on natural gas. Of course, the other reason natural gas is necessary is it can be used as a backup for variable sources such as solar or wind.
That's great, Terry. Thank you, Larry. Herb, I'd like to kind of throw out a question to you that kind of came up in the chat. And again, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all the questions. We'll tackle as many as we can. But the question about what can governments do to better facilitate kind of clean energy and kind of clean growth in this region? Is there something that you'd like to highlight in terms of what's the role of provincial or even the federal government here in the region to facilitate our region's transition?
So there's 2 prongs to this. One is, if we want to be producing our own supply of energy as opposed to just importing, the terms of trade under clean growth have shifted to the hydro-producing provinces, as you noted. There's probably enough supply that we could supply our region as long as we don't industrially grow and decarbonize the last 20% that we have left to go on electricity. But probably the biggest item that I've learned about working with the Smart Grid Innovation Network is really we need a change in the regulatory environment, because the regulator is so focused on maintaining affordable energy under the existing technologies for consumers that it doesn't create the fiscal capacity of an NB Power or utility to make the investments that they need to do in the tech that they need to make that transition. They don't create the signals to consumers that you need to be acquiring some of the smart meters, smart thermostats, and all the other devices that are coming along that would allow for more control to do a lot of these things. And so we have to start taking a look at what it is that the government is actually trying to do when it does things like announces rate freezes, when they have a strong regulator that has a mandate that has frankly been resisting something as obvious as smart meters to come in. To me, it's that the modernization of the regulatory environment would be one big step we could take, and second would be moving towards regional decision making on power supply and energy supply as opposed to province by province.
Great, thank you, Herb. So I'm going to give the panelists some opportunities to jump in if there's some questions they would like to quickly respond to. We've had a few questions just about the future of nuclear and kind of particularly small modular reactors. We will be specifically addressing that in our next webinar on September the 30th when we're talking about some of the specific new technologies that are in play. We are also questions here about kind of greater regional working together more as a region and collaboration. Again, that is a topic we'll be coming back to on October the 15th. So I don't want to take too much time for those questions right now. But there's certainly some questions on other kind of technologies, biogas or offshore wind. So if Charlene wants to come back on that, you're welcome. But we certainly had a question here about the Indigenous community and how do we kind of support this kind of transition, working with our First Nations communities, either provincially or across the Atlantic region as we think about kind of clean growth and energy transformation. Anyone like to express some thoughts on the strategy or approach in terms of involving and including in the role of our First Nation communities? Any of our panelists want to jump in on that one?
I know the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and Oil and Gas Co., the division that oversees our offshore here, does a lot of work with Indigenous communities and informing them of what's happening and where the opportunities are. At NOIA, when I came here, I saw that's something that we weren't doing much of. So we've started reaching out, and in fact, at our major conference last year, where over 1,000 people attended, we invited Indigenous leaders to come to our conference free of charge and started the conversations there. I went to Labrador and talked about the opportunities and how we can work together. And the big round is coming up there next year, 2021. So for major opportunities there. It was originally thought that it was gas, but the latest information in 3D information points to oil. I saw somebody had a question about offshore wind, and that study is currently ongoing. The main focus is for future installations, future platforms on new projects. It's very difficult to change out what is there now, but that is being looked at, and if we want to see if that's a consideration as well. But there still needs to be a backup as well, because of course these platforms cannot be without power. So INTEC-C is a NOIA member that's doing the piece of research on offshore wind. I don't have specifics right now on wind speeds or anything like that, but we're expecting to have the report presented to us next month. So I can happily share that with David, and we can get it out to the person who asked the question. But it's a really exciting area for us. Anyone who's been to Newfoundland and Labrador knows we have plenty of wind, lots of wind offshore. If there was a way we could transform fog in some way too, that would be pretty ingenious. But offshore wind and certainly hydro, we have an abundance of hydro. So all of those things are being looked at. I don't have specifics, but as soon as we do, we'll happily share. And I love the idea of collaboration amongst all of the Atlantic provinces.
Great, thank you, Charlene. A question maybe to Director Larry. I think it's come up maybe at least one question in the chat just around or even Rachel, you might have thoughts on this too, but what's the role of energy storage? Where do you see that fitting in terms of kind of our future energy and kind of shift to kind of more sustainable, cleaner growth?
Does Rachel want to go first, or? I'll go first if you like, Rachel. I mean,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I can follow.
Okay. I was just actually typing a response to Shavana's question about this. Storage is clean. It's a clean alternative to natural gas once you have the storage capability. An example is the Alton Alton salt caverns near Truro. And that is in order to clean out, if you will, the caverns. They have to the brine has to be pumped out and pumped into the Shubenacadie River. So as a result, yes, perhaps you could store compressed the air in the caverns, but the downside is you're going to have an environmental impact, dumping the brine into the Shubenacadie River. That's one. The other, for example, if we talk about lithium, which of course is storage for electric vehicles and batteries, to handle periods when there is either no wind or solar drops off periodically. The storage, if it's using, not if, it will be using various metals and so forth, and that have to be mined either from the ocean or from various countries. In those situations, essentially we are shifting the environmental problem from, for example, cleaning out the Alton salt caverns to other countries. So I suppose the argument is there is no free lunch. Really what we should be doing, I would argue initially at least, is we should be doing everything we can to reduce our energy demand. We want to do as much decoupling of our economy from the energy system, and as we bring that down, we can then decarbonize the energy system to make it be less emissions intensive. So yes, storage will be necessary if we're going with variable renewables. Life can be made less expensive, I suppose, if we then use storage for if we can reduce the amount of storage we require. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Larry. We've had quite a few questions. We've tackled some of them we've responded to directly in the chat. I know some of the new technologies, nuclear, the role of solar, and I believe hydrogen will be addressing in our next webinar. So I certainly encourage you to sign up for that. I'm going to give the panelists one last chance to either make some closing remarks or respond to a question they've seen that they've not had a chance to answer to. And I'll start with Charlene. But Herb, maybe I'll just begin with you first. There's been a couple of questions just around pricing and pricing for industry versus pricing for consumers, but also kind of Atlantic Canada's overall cost of energy, and how do we work with this if that's kind of causing some of our industry here to be less competitive, and what does that look like going forward? Any thoughts around, or just some clarification, I think was one of the questions, just around the pricing structure we currently have and how we transition to something that's more competitive to support our growth going forward, and then we'll do a quick wrap up for all the other panelists.
Well, I think the issue on pricing is really key if you're trying to talk about a transition. If you have a regulator that's focused on issues of fairness between different market segments, large industry, smaller industry, and households, you start to decouple the concern about, do you have a competitive pricing system so that your exporters can get to market and compete? And we saw in the mid-2000s that regulators across Canada started doing cost of service regulation that took away what you would call the historic advantage of all the investments in low-cost power in New Brunswick, at least, and probably the other provinces. We saw a shift towards deregulating energy markets in other provinces to have export potential to the US. We saw attempts to sell NB Power to Hydro-Quebec to deal with this regional system. So we can talk about all these technologies we want to shift to, but until we reconcile that we have to allow the price signals to operate and not regulate them or dampen it, it's going to be tough to sort of push a transition if there's one you want to get to, or balance what you're worried about with the large industrial consumers if you're going to make financing the cost of the transition borne by large industrial users who are very price sensitive, particularly with investment. And this comes back to the first question I had, which is what in the triumvirate of all the things you could be identifying, growth, clean energy, equality or equity in pricing, what's the priority across those three? Historically, we had populations in Atlantic Canada that prioritized growth over all else. Now we've had the three coming in. The big discussion for this topic really has to be governments, decision makers determining what weights do we put on those three dimensions to get the sweet spot that Rachel discussed. But until then, there really is no answer.
Great, thank you, Herb. So Charlene, I know you've got a tight finish, but any closing comments or points you'd like to respond to in the last 30 seconds for you?
Sure. I'm very excited about the transition and the clean technology aspect of it, but oil and gas needs to be a part of that solution. And anyone who's heard me speak knows that I speak often of Norway, and they are still drilling 57 wells a year exploring for oil, while at the same time they lead the world per capita in the number of electric vehicles. So it's using the money from the non-renewables to help with that transition to renewables, at the same time recognizing that renewables need a backup as well. So it's as I said before, it's about using all forms of energy to provide us with our needs. And thank you for the opportunity today.
Great, thank you, Charlene. So maybe Rachel, I'll just give you the final chance to speak. I know there's been questions about your report. We will kind of share that on our social media. Colleen said she'll post your report on their website too, so people will see that. But any closing thoughts or comment you'd like to leave us with as we wrap up today?
Sure, I'll respond to the question that was specifically about clean growth data and what could be improved. And I'll highlight Ecotech Quebec as a good example of the way they highlight their clean technology firms and the specific information that they provide on them. And also some of the cluster activities that are happening in Quebec and the relationship between a utility like Hydro-Quebec and some of the small innovative clean technology firms in terms of pushing forward electrification technologies.
That's great. So I'd like to bring this kind of discussion to a close. I think I want to thank all the panelists. I think everyone's appreciated your insights and perspectives that you brought to the table. I know there's a lot more we can say about this. It's certainly an area in terms of climate change and the impacts of that on our economy, and clean growth is certainly two topics that we would like to tackle in the upcoming year. And Rachel and her team are doing research on this nationally, and Colleen is continuing to work on various issues. And as you know, Noya is continuing to advance their sector. So there's a lot of needs and questions for research and moving forward. How do we make this transition? So I'd like to thank everyone for participating today. I'd like to thank all four panelists. I'd like to again thank Colleen and the Atlantica Centre for partnering with us. Again, we will continue this conversation in a couple of weeks. We're looking at specific technologies, and in a month's time, we'll be looking at more about the role of regional energy cooperation. So again, the slides and the video recording will be available on our website. Again, thank you everyone for participating, and please, I hope you have a great day. Thank you.